Okay, if you'll give me your attention, the next 90 minutes is going to be your time. You're going to have an opportunity to discuss with our distinguished panel about UFO encounters that you may have had or ones that you have heard about. And they will make remarks as well as listen to your stories. I want to introduce our distinguished panel right now. First on my left, I have Mr. Noe Torres. I have Mr. Stanton Friedman. I have Mr. Dennis Balthaser. Dennis Balthaser, is that correct?
That's close.
That's close. Okay, I got Ruben.
That's close.
Uriarte.
There you go.
Arte. Ruben Uriarte. There you go. I'm going to get y'all to change your name the next time you come. Ismael Cuellar. Got you, Ismael. I had no problem with you, period. All right. And my friend Brad Newton. Man in black.
Thank you, Mr. Carr.
Lord have mercy, what name. Okay, without any further delay, I think Noe Torres, you're going to be kind of the moderator, and you're going to take care of this thing. We got 90 minutes now, so don't bogart your stories too much. But anyway, okay, fellas, here we go. You got it.
Okay, we're going to start off with a very remarkable story. And, Ruben Uriarte and I wrote a book a few years back called Mexico's Roswell. And it's about the reported crash, as many of you already know the story, but just to recap for those who may not be as familiar. There was supposedly a mid-air collision between a small plane coming out of El Paso and an unidentified flying object that had been picked up on military radar coming in from the Gulf of Mexico. It was seen around Corpus Christi, it zoomed south toward Brownsville, Texas, and then it went inland about 40 miles south of Brownsville in northern Mexico. Then this object reportedly followed the curvature of the Rio Grande River more or less on the Mexican side. And when it got to the area around Presidio, reportedly here in the mountains across the river from us, really the closest place, geographically speaking, would be Candelaria. And across the river from Candelaria, supposedly the UFO, the unknown object, and the small plane collided midair, and the debris fell down to the desert below. So the UFO was not seriously damaged. It was not, it was forced to land, but there wasn't very much apparent damage. And a recovery effort was mounted by both the Mexican government, the Mexican soldiers, Mexican military thought they had just a downed plane. It was a small plane of Mexican registry. It was headed to Mexico City. So they thought they were going to investigate the crash site and see, what had happened to the plane. They presumed that there had been no survivors. So they went out in the area of El Llano, which is a flat plain just on the other side of the mountain range that fronts the Rio Grande River around Candelaria. And they went out there, tried to make a recovery effort, but they were not prepared for what they found. Because what they found at the scene was not just a plane that had been essentially smashed to smithereens, but a short distance away, there was a silver disc, Saturn-shaped disc, just like we've all seen in pictures from other UFO sightings, that had landed, and the soldiers gathered around that, the Mexican soldiers gathered around that. They had brought jeeps and trucks out to the location thinking that they were going to recover pieces of the crashed plane. And they did do that, but they also recovered this object, put it up on a flatbed truck, and were headed back to their base. But within an hour, all of the Mexican soldiers perished due to exposure to an unknown toxic agent. They were not prepared with any sort of hazardous material, equipment. As I had mentioned, they thought they were going to a plane crash, and they were not prepared. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. team came in, assembled at Fort Bliss in El Paso. Team consisted of several military helicopters, Huey class, and a large cargo helicopter. They found the place where the Mexican truck convoy and jeep convoy had stopped in the desert. Some of the soldiers from Mexico were lying in the desert, partway out of their vehicles. And it was at that point that the U.S. team made the recovery, and supposedly after the UFO had been airlifted out on the double rotor chopper helicopter, after the UFO was taken out and the soldiers gathered all the remaining evidence from the scene and exploded it using high explosives or a low-yield thermonuclear device, which at that time was known as a suitcase nuke. Well, we had witnesses from the Mexican side of this event. We had talked to some of the folks out at the ranches that line the Rio Grande River on the Mexican side. We have talked to ranchers out there who, in 1974, during this time period, had seen and felt a massive explosion, had seen things in the sky. And so we had some witnesses on the U.S. side. But then after this event that we were all attending today was publicized, we were able to contact some folks who live up in the Ruidosa area. Mrs. Johnny Chambers, a longtime educator who taught in one-room schoolhouse for many years. I believe 38 years, Mrs. Chambers, that you taught altogether. And Mrs. Chambers and her son John, in 1974, were coming down the mountain from Hot Springs, Chinante Hot Springs. And they were, as the road winds down the mountain and kind of faces Mexico across the Rio Grande, when they saw this massive explosion coming up over the mountain. So when they heard that there was this case called Mexico's Roswell, which they had never heard about before, and we had Mr. Charles Angel, who does a tour business here in Presidio, made contact with them, told them about the festival, told them about the book Mexico's Roswell, and then they said, hey, we may have seen something related to that. And then they told us a story. So we're very honored today we're going to start off this town hall meeting by asking Mrs. Johnny Chambers to come up and relate the story to us of that amazing day when she and her son were driving down from Chinante Hot Springs, and they saw this remarkable sight across the river in Mexico. Mrs. Chambers, thank you for joining us today.
This is John took me here, and so we had this made for you. And so anyway, I thought it might help you reminisce about your story.
Yes, sir. All it needs is a bright light on the other side of the mountain.
I think we got one of those too, if you want to see it.
Okay. Hello, as you know, my name is Johnny. Everybody calls me Johnny or Miss Chambers. Depends on how old you are. I was teaching in Ruidosa, and it was in September or in October. We're not sure because I did make a note of it. And it was in 1973, late October 1973, or in 1974. That's as close as I can get to it because we didn't make a note of it because we were very interested in it at the time, but we heard nothing about it afterwards. There was nothing, nobody said anything, or nobody talked about it. And of course, I was busy at school. I was teaching 8th grades in primitive setting, and so I stayed very, very busy. I can't be sure of the date. It was close to this date. And John, Oh,
You say that's pretty close to,
that's pretty close to what it was, except there was a lot of red and blue light in it. Very dark red and very dark blue. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a retired FBI agent, and he said that the blue indicated metal burning. And he asked me if there was an odor, and I said, we were so far away we couldn't smell it. We had to go to Hot Springs every evening to take a bath. We had to drive 14 miles to take a bath. Going back real back, I had to drive for it. And because we didn't have water at the school for bathing. And my son John didn't mind going because Jack Kingston was running the hot springs at the time, and he fed him. So, if you feed this young boy, he'll do anything for food. The night that we stick my hands in my pocket, and they're always getting me in trouble. The night that this happened, it was a little after dusk. There was no sunlight, but it wasn't quite dark yet. And we were coming down the ridge. There's a picture here that we produced, a friend of mine produced for me on the computer. And we were coming down the ridge, and we were high up on the ridge here in the mountain, just downriver from Vista Canyon, if you know where Vista Canyon is. That's exactly where it was, more or less right behind where Bloomberg's house is, across the river from Bloomberg's house at this time. I believe there's a cattle barn on the highway there. It's 150. Ruidosa is 7 miles from Hot Springs, and coming down the mountain, as a crow flies, you would be about 5 miles from Ruidosa as a crow flies. The glow from the explosion lit up the whole sky. I mean, it just was glorious, actually. And the rays from the fire extended high into the air. And we stopped the car and got out and looked at it because it was awe-inspiring. It's just it's something you don't see. I presumed that it was a military aircraft that was loaded with something or other that crashed into the mountain, because later we had a lot of military flying low over Candelaria when I went up there to teach. So after watching for a while, we proceeded on down the ridge, but we could see the glow all the way to the highway. I kept looking for some mention of this in the newspaper or magazine or radio or somebody to mention it. And John, being a child, he was out talking to people, and he may have heard more than I did afterwards. But I heard nothing else about it until just recently. Charlie Angel and my son got to talking to each other, and he said, "Oh yeah, we saw that." So it's phenomenal. I would be interested to know what it was and why nothing was ever mentioned about it in the newspapers. And that's what we saw, and I'll swear to it. If you have any idea, I'd really like to know, as I'm sure you all would. There was something else you wanted to mention once.
A few days after the incident, I was talking to some other people from Candelaria, and they mentioned seeing helicopters coming back out of Mexico. That's, them telling me this. I can't swear to it, seeing it myself. So that's really all I can say about the helicopter.
We're going to take some questions for Mrs. Chambers and her son John. And but before we go to the audience's questions, Mrs. Chamber, I remember that when you and I talked, when I interviewed you regarding this, you mentioned you were just guessing that the fireball you saw over the mountain was maybe 4 to 5 miles wide. Would you say that's fair?
I would say that's correct. They would be at least that wide. It covered
Most of the mountains.
most of the top of this mountain. If you look, I don't know whether you can see this mountain or not, but it covered this area of the mountain here. Huge fire. And that's why I couldn't ever understand why there was nothing ever written or mentioned about it afterwards.
What were some of the colors that you saw mixed in with this fireball? Do you all recall some of the colors?
Mostly purple and red. I remember those two colors very brilliant. Perfectly, because you don't see purple fire very often. It's usually red and orange. But this was a purple and red fire.
I also remember during our interview that you said it was clear to you, you had seen like forest fires or brush on fire on the mountains. You had heard about a plane crash, or you had heard about plane crashes, but this was clearly not either of those. This was something unique. What made you think that it was unique?
Mostly the size of it and the color of it. The color of it and the size of it said definitely it was something unusual.
The other thing I wanted to ask John, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. When you talked to the folks, some of the folks that lived around Candelaria, they mentioned military helicopters that came in from Mexico. I believe you said that they saw a larger helicopter, like a dual rotor. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, I guess they call it what they use, not use, but it doubles the color. And carry cargo, they saw something. Now, whether it was carrying anything, I can't swear to that. But that's all.
Now, what was interesting is that in our story, Mexico's Roswell, one of the key components of it is that after the U.S. recovered the downed UFO, of course, the military recovery team came back to Fort Bliss area, came back to the Texas side, and according to these documents that recorded this case, called the Dene documents, they used a cargo helicopter, dual rotor, to bring it across the Rio Grande River in the Candelaria area. And so that's what, when we heard from Charlie Angel, that he had spoken to John and to his mom, and that John had heard the talk of the helicopters coming back across, then of course Ruben and I were extremely interested in that. Our panel members, do you have follow-up questions you'd like to ask at this time?
Have there been any articles or letters placed in the newspapers seeking reports from others who might have seen something at that time, giving an address, a phone number, some way for them to get in touch with you? Because I found you've got to throw a big net to get useful information.
That's a good question, and this is kind of our net today. We've been publicizing this for weeks, and we're hoping that, the publicity surrounding this festival actually resulted directly in Mrs. Chambers and John coming forward with their story. So we're hoping that others will be motivated. If they're not present here today, then perhaps they'll contact us in the near future by email or by talking to one of our local people that we work with.
I'd like to add one thing. We are far removed from the lights of the city, so we see the sky more clearly than people who live in the city. Over at the farm, which is about 10 miles up in the mountains in Sierra Viejas from the Candelaria, my husband and I had taken our cots out in the yard. It was so nice and cool and bright and pretty out there that we decided we'd sleep in there. And I said, I laid down and I said, "Oh, Mom, look at the big light coming over the mountain." And he says, "Where?" And that was gone. 5 seconds, I would say, it took it to go over the horizon, and it had to be at least 50 miles. And we see things like that all the time.
About what year, more or less, would you say that happened? Would that be around the same time?
1970.
Around 1970, okay. There's a question from our audience member. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I am just a little bit confused. I think I heard you say that the government took the UFO away. What did they explode?
There were two explosions involved here in this case. The first one was the mid-air collision between a small plane and a UFO. At first, Ruben and I talked about what the chambers had seen, and we thought that perhaps we were looking at the fireball that resulted from this very fast-moving UFO and the small plane colliding over El Llano, which is, 15, 20 miles across the river from Candelaria. But then we discussed it further, and we thought the fireball they saw may have been the explosives used to sanitize the area to eliminate all remaining evidence of what had occurred. Now, people would get on us because we had the theory that perhaps a suitcase nuke was used. One person told us, a nuke would just spread any contamination. Whatever it was that killed the Mexican soldiers, detonating a nuke would just spread whatever contaminants there were right all over the environment. But then Ruben and I ran across on the internet a document that was released under the Freedom of Information Act by the U.S. military, stating that, giving exactly what we thought was the case, which is that a limited thermonuclear device could be used to sanitize an area of any possible biological or chemical contamination over a certain site. The scenario is oddly similar to a book and a movie, book by Michael Crichton called The Andromeda Strain, and the subsequent movie, part of which was ironically filmed here in nearby Shafter, Texas. Anybody been out to Shafter and seen the small church there that was used in the Andromeda Strain? Well, that book by Michael Crichton, which he wrote when he was a medical student, and he had access, he was working on some government projects, and he had access to information about how the government would react in the case of a biological contamination, especially one that came out of space. And so that's what the movie was about. And ironically, what happened in Coyame area, in El Llano, here near Presidio, has some similarities to that fictional account. Other questions for Mr. Chambers or John Chambers? Yes, in the back. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it's a good question, and
What is the question?
the question is that was any sort of autopsy conducted on the fallen Mexican soldiers who were obviously exposed to some kind of lethal agent? And the answer is we have not uncovered any information about that. However, we work with Mexican UFO researchers. In fact, some of the ones that were here speaking in Ojinaga, Ruben and I have corresponded with them over the years since the book came out. And they have, they tell us that a lot of the soldiers in the Mexican military come from poor, small areas of southern Mexico. And oftentimes, all that the families are told is your son regrettably died in a training accident, an accident during maneuvers and training. And they are never, in many cases, are never given any opportunity to know more details. So we feel that the soldiers from Mexico, the families were never told the circumstances surrounding their death. There's no evidence to suggest that any sort of autopsies or investigation into their deaths was conducted. And I think the main mission of the U.S. recovery team was just to grab the UFO and go. Dennis has a question.
Do you know if the Mexican government has the Freedom of Information law that could be processed? Unlike ours, you probably wouldn't get information either, but it's it'd be worth looking at.
We'll have to check into the Freedom of Information Act. Yes, if there are no further questions for Mrs. Chambers, we're going to have her take her seat. Yes, yes.
Are there any documents on finding the UFO or what? Well, never mind.
Thank you to Mrs. Chambers, and we'll respond to that question in a minute. Yes, ma'am.
This may be very cynical, but we only have the United States security people saying that the Mexicans were poisoned by some alien agent. What if we just went down there, we saw they were escaping off with something we wanted, and we just wiped them out and stole the UFO and brought
The
it back?
reason we don't think that's likely is because the Mexican president, the Mexican administration at the time was very favorable toward the U.S., and there had been a lot of cases, and there were ties between the CIA office in Mexico City and the Mexican government at that time. And we have recorded instances where the two countries cooperated on the retrieval of American hardware that went down in northern Mexico, i.e. Test missiles and other military hardware that unfortunately accidentally landed in Mexico, and the U.S. was allowed to come in and recover. We don't think that there would have been a reason for the U.S. to go set off some kind of explosive or nuclear device. We think that at higher levels there was an agreement in place. The Mexican field level commanders did not know about this. They thought they were just going out there to help with a plane crash.
Why didn't the Americans get contaminated with
They went in full biohazard gear, which we have samples of over here at this table you can look at afterward. They went in fully prepared. They had already staged. There was a team at the ready, and so that's what it was. Yes, ma'am.
How was this photograph obtained of the explosion?
Magic.
No, I took the photograph. I was with John Chambers, and he was nice enough to take me in, and I said, I want to get a picture of exactly where you took this photograph.
No, I'm talking about the one that's on the table.
Yeah, this one. Okay, now, there's a thing called Photoshop. So I sent it to Noe, and based on what his conversations with John and Mrs. Chambers, he's pretty good at Photoshop. I'm pretty lousy at it actually, but I do have fun with it. And so he sent it back to me, and it was in color, and it really looked Photoshop. Okay, and so as a kid, you saw all the nuclear blasts and everything. They were always in black and white. So I took it and did it in black and white. I took it to an enlarger, plugged it in, picked it, and so we thought it would be kind of fun to have a recreation based on that. And John, I believe John said it was pretty close. Or Ms. Chambers? Yeah, you said that was pretty close to what it looked like? Okay, so anyway, we were guessing, and we were having a little bit of fun, and so that's how we did that.
Okay, there's a question there in the middle. Yes, ma'am.
Earlier on, you mentioned that the UFO was not damaged that badly within a small plane like that. What would cause it to be an explosion? Because if the UFO wasn't damaged and you got a small plane, what would cause that huge fireball?
That's a good question. That's why we're favoring the theory that what the Chambers might have seen would have been the explosion afterwards. So that's a very good point. However, the UFO was traveling at a pretty high rate of speed, although we don't know the exact speed. We don't know what the mid-air collision would look like, especially since we're not aware of the, all of the flight characteristics of an object like this, the UFO. But perhaps it wouldn't produce a fireball quite like what the Chambers saw. That's a good point. Other questions? Do our panelists have any thoughts or observations you'd like to share? Ruben.
Hey, yesterday, both Brad and I had a chance to go over to see the Mexican investigators' presentation, and one gentleman there said that he met someone else whose family member, a known family member, also is familiar with and may have information for us in terms of the Oyame incident. And then today, this morning, there's another gentleman here who said, oh, my mother knows something about this. So little by little, this is why we felt it was important to have a town hall meeting so we can be able to make these connections. And there's other witnesses out there that later that we're going to be following up on. But, you know, I have to go back and all this is, both Noe and I, we're taking this information, we're learning from other investigators, from Stanton Friedman and from Dennis Balthaser. We've learned a lot from them and how they do their investigations, how they go out and conduct and meet with witnesses. It's a long process. And what was the stand? Well, the Roswell incident happened in 1947, and you first started investigating it in 1978. So I think, as Noe was mentioning, and Will mentioned this earlier, it's taken almost, what, 30 years or so, but now you know, this is all coming together little by little.
Okay, ideally, if anybody has some thoughts to express about your own experiences or those of someone that you know, ideally, it would be neat if you could come up to the podium and say that, but if you feel more comfortable just speaking from where you're seated, we can also do that, so it's entirely up to you. So we'll just kind of throw it open, and if you know, nobody feels prepared at this moment, then we'll just discuss among ourselves for a little bit, and we'll have kind of a panel discussion about what we've heard so far in the conference. But is there anybody that would like to at this time? Yes, sir. Would you like to speak from there? Or
I'll speak from here.
Okay, yes, sir.
So, since moving to this area about 7 years ago, I'd never seen a UFO. I have been seeing UFOs now nearly weekly. And, you know, in my own mind, I've just kind of come to the conclusion that because of the proximity to Laughlin Air Force Base, and because of the history of the region being the site of the U-2 program, that what we're seeing is military technology. I'm just wondering if you guys could speak to that. A relationship between the region, the frequency of the sightings. I think it's a common occurrence of people who live in this area to also see things frequently.
Who would like to respond to the military technology being the explanation of that? Pass that down to Brad.
Well, I'll just start there.
Okay.
Well, I do know from being in the Rotary Club, I had some B-1 pilots come. And we were on the flight path for the training for the B-1 bombers, and just the other day, my wife and I saw one, and they cross across Button Flats up there by Citadel Creek, and they're low, they're fast. They used to be green, that one was blue, wasn't it, Peggy? And so we both saw, you know, and because I knew what it was from my days of living in Fort Stockton, of course, I've had the opportunity to visit the two B-1 crews that come out of Abilene. And so, but they fly around here, and then I cannot recall the year, but they had one crash over by Valentine, and they kept overriding the computer at the side of the mountain. And reportedly, there wasn't any piece much bigger than a basketball left of it whenever it hit. So I think that it's fairly common. They used to fly flights out of Del Rio up this way. So I've seen all kinds of different kinds of aircraft. And then one of the other things, we had a thing on the internet the other day where they had a sighting over around the Fort Davis area. And not too long ago, earlier in the year, in a bad weather event, the aerostat crashed Well, they've got a new one over there, and I heard that they've been running it up and down. And so a lot of times, and you can see that thing for miles. You can, as you're going back to Marfa, you can look to the west. Sun's just right. You can see that thing up there too. So, yes, there is a lot of military aircraft in the area, but they didn't send me their flight schedule. So, anyway.
I was asked a similar question this morning in my Area 51 lecture, and at that time I said that I believe a lot of what is seen in the western United States could possibly be our own aircraft. And if you read the Area 51 lecture, I talked a lot about the new aircraft that are being developed, the ones we know that have been developed and test flown there. There's no telling what they are doing in Area 51 as far as new technology, new aircraft, and things like that. You have to remember that about 90% of what people see and possibly report as UFOs are explainable. The planet Venus, which I turned into the Mutual UFO Network years ago, thinking it was a UFO, balloons, our own aircraft. There's a lot of things that are up there that are explainable. The part that we're interested in as researchers is the 5 or 10% that's unexplainable. And the thing to remember about UFO is exactly that. It's an unidentified flying object.
We also have drones in the area too.
You know, sorry, going back to the relation that occurred, Chambers, American view about it, that type of predation, have a crash on the ground, it has to be a very large impact, which affected both aircraft. Has there been any search for artifacts of that, well, I guess maybe a Piper or Cessna? And if there has been, I would imagine that it's some pieces of that aircraft fell and you would find possibly a piece of the other craft as well in the same vicinity.
The question is, has anyone searched for artifacts resulting from the reported crash of this UFO and this plane in the area around El Llano? Interestingly enough, we do have some pieces of a small plane at our table. You all are welcome to look at afterward. We went out with the History Channel on a film shoot out where this incident supposedly happened. And we found in the desert, actually Ruben and I had gone there previously and located the crash site. There was a large area where debris from a small plane that's been dated as being around in the 1970s. Don't remember right now the exact model of it, but it fell in the desert and it scattered all over and there were pieces all over. So there has been a search. We don't know for certain, and in the program, the History Channel, UFO Hunters, we told them that Ruben and I were not certain that this was related to the 1974 Koyama UFO incident, but it was a small plane that we found debris from that was in about the right place. So as far as confirmed finding of the actual site where there might be debris, no, we don't have that. In this plane crash that we did find near the small town of Koyama, the desert was littered with aluminum from the skin of the airplane that had been subjected to intense heat and had become a liquid state and then had solidified into globs of aluminum. It was all over the desert, you know, integrated into the brush and on the rocks. So the History Channel paid for laboratory analysis of that stuff. And they found it, you know, to be composed mostly of what we would expect, you know, the airplane skin to be composed of, but there were some trace elements in there that the equipment, the lab equipment, could not identify. So we don't know if that's something that got transferred onto, we don't know if that's something that got transferred onto the aluminum after it impacted on the desert floor, or what the conjecture that the History Channel people were making was that perhaps there are trace elements resulting from the collision with the UFO in these globs of aluminum. So, but once again, that's strictly a might be or possibly could be. There's no direct evidence that we can say conclusively. But it was very interesting to find this in about the spot where we would expect it, and having it be a small plane from circa 1970s. Do you remember the model of the plane that it was identified based on?
It was sort of a Cessna.
It was a Cessna type plane, and we found some numbers on some of the components, you know, the instrument panel components and stuff that were scattered all over the desert. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. When we went down with the History Channel, we had a Geiger counter that the team from the History Channel had. And they were scanning all around, and it was just a little bit elevated from normal radiation that you find out in the desert, you know. But then there was this hole, this pit. And it's really interesting because this pit is visible from Google Earth. If you look at this spot from Google Earth, you see this black spot, like some big explosion happened there. And right in the middle of the black spot, there's a hole or a pit going straight down. Well, when they put the Geiger counter probe down into that, one of the guys stuck his arm way down there and then dangled the probe beyond that. The meter just spiked all the way up. So we don't know if, you know, maybe some radioactive waste was thrown down there in the pit, or was this related to the 1974 incident? It was in approximately the place where we would expect something like this. But once again, you know, the History Channel people told us that it's very difficult to get permission to excavate, you know, this, especially for agencies from outside of Mexico to request permission to excavate on these public lands. So it didn't go any further than that. But it's a mystery zone there. Other questions? Or do our panelists have? Oh, here's a question that came in by email. Oh.
The gentleman there has that.
Was there a comment over here?
Yeah.
Yes, time ago, Mrs. I forgot this.
Chambers? Mrs. Chambers?
She said that she saw the ball fire that was a unique color of that fire.
Yes, sir.
She said was like
purple
and red. So that one is pretty strange. For
Pretty
example,
strange.
I have the opportunity to see materials zirconium, for example, when they explode, it looks a little bit like you said. So there were any investigation due to that fact that those colors may represent a material for
That's burning.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is investigation, trying to figure out, okay, those colors look like the airplane or the UFO, whatever,
I see what you're saying.
whatever it is.
The problem there would be that we don't know what materials the UFO was composed of. Or, you know, if
No, but what I'm saying is, due to those colors, there were an investigator or something that is saying, for example, if you hit titanium, zirconium, or whatever, it might look like that.
Okay.
There were investigations.
So in other words, what kind of materials would you have to burn, and at what temperatures to produce that color? That's a very good idea. Thank you. Write that one down.
While I was with the Texas Highway Department, we did a lot of I did a lot of inspection on aluminum light poles and things like that. And the arc that comes off of welding aluminum is one of the most beautiful blue colors you ever saw. Now, I don't know if this is what Mrs. Chambers is talking about as far as the color, but aluminum does give a blue arc during welding. Under melting, I'm not sure what color it would be.
Ruben had a comment?
Anyone here familiar with your fire extinguishers? You know, Class A, Class B, Class C, and Class D. And I believe that D is primarily for fighting off or being able to extinguish metals. I know that like back in the Vietnam days when many of our helicopters, I believe, were built out of magnesium, and they would, if those helicopters would crash, of course the magnesium would be lighted up, and cause an enormous fire. So definitely we need to check those different kinds of metals and see how the different color scheme and that, and be able to tie that in. And to bring what Mrs. Chambers had seen her and her son that day.
Any of our panelists have additional thoughts before we go to another question? Yes, sir.
Real quick, Noe, you don't do any studies, the National Department of Parks and Wildlife, if there was any fish kills that occurred in the later months?
Fish kills?
Yes.
Very interesting. The question was, did we check with anybody that's equivalent to the Parks and Wildlife Department in Mexico to see if there were any fish kills or maybe other type of animal kills in the area around August 1974? And the question is, we haven't, but that's a great idea, and Ruben is writing furiously.
When Noe and I were doing research, we came across a number of crashes of V-2 rockets that was being launched out of Fort Bliss back in 1947. They were testing these rockets that they brought back from Germany. And so there were two crashes in 1947, which is described in our book. Also, there was another rocket that crashed into another part of Chihuahua, into the Zone of Silence, or La Zona de Silencio, which is an area that covers 3 states, Durango, Chihuahua, and Coahuila. What's very interesting, I believe it was in '73 that the Athena rocket had some radioactive material, and when it exploded in that area, it went haywire. As the missile was supposed to launch out of New Mexico, and then unfortunately it missed its mark and crashed in Mexico in that area. The fact that that missile carried some radioactive material, and now the ecologists in that particular, they have a biosphere laboratory. They've been studying some of the effects. Now, whether or not it's connected with the radiation or not, but there's specific species of turtles or tortoises that are only unique in that. And they've been looking at the radiation effects to see whether or not how these animals have adapted. Also a unique species of cactus. Maybe also that area has been also the high impact of meteorites as well, and other anomalies. So that's something interesting to see whether or not we can get some additional information. But there was a huge campaign, coordination of picking up all that contaminated soil. They built a special railroad to haul back tons of soil that was radioactive back to the United States because of that missile. So there's a good chapter in that describes that. Noe? So I believe now what we'd like to do is turn it back to you, and I'd like to ask any of you if any of you have had your own particular sighting experience, whether or not it was in this area or elsewhere. You know, some of you may have seen strange lights, maybe strange orbs. Maybe you have a loved one that may have seen a UFO, a friend, maybe your own personal sighting. So we would like to get your opinion on that. And Noe and I, we're going to end very shortly after the break from the panel. When we come back, we're going to elaborate further on the Mexico's Roswell case. So I'd like to turn it over to any of you who wish to share, you know, your sighting or your experience.
Okay, I'm gonna reset it. And
Okay.
we'll see what
I know it may be intimidating, but maybe it's some information that you've been holding back that you like to share with the group. Sometimes that may spark someone else's memory and say, oh, that's true. I remember I too have had that experience. So, if you'd like to, oh, there you go. You would like to come up and, or I'll give you the microphone there.
I also have a question.
Okay.
Phone number, if we see something.
Sure, there's several phone numbers.
This was in north of Houston, 1988, in Tomball area. 11 o'clock at night. For once it was clear in Houston. So I was letting my dog out and looking up the stars and going from west to east on an angle was a cylindrical, it looked like it was the size of the Goodyear blimp, series of lights. It was almost like it was a cage. Best way to describe it. It was softly glowing orange, totally silent, no smoke, and it just slowly went right over my head. I called everybody, the airport, the police, anything. I went in the phone book, I called everything I could think of. There was no mention on the news, there was no mention in any of the newspapers. And as far as I know, I'm the only one who saw it. All my friends, I've called everybody. And this was in 1988, and nothing. Never seen anything like it since. I saw something else in Montana, I think 1979, just a point of light going very fast and then gone. And that's it. So I need a phone number.
Thank you very much for sharing that. There are a couple of organizations. The one that I do belong to is called MUFON, Mutual UFO Network. And we do have a, you can get online, you can file that report. We have a database. We're going to be, we monitor all the reports. We have, once you file a report, an investigator from MUFON will be contacting you and try to contact and get as much information. Now, the thing that you saw, the strange orb, strange light, I've been looking at our statistics. We've had close to, now we're going to be nearing close to 40,000 reports, and that's from the year 2000. And I actually have a breakdown as to the types of reports that are being seen, reported by witnesses. You know, how many triangles, how many, for example, cylinder-shaped objects, many saucer reports. I look at it through the United States, through the states as well. The biggest category that has been reported to us so far have been these strange orb-shaped objects. It's been over 5,000 within the last, let's see here. I looked at the last 4 years, and we have over 5,000 reports. This year alone, we already have over 1,600 so far. We're not even finished with the year 2000. So that's one of the recommendations we can give to you. You see something strange. And there's other numbers that we can refer to you as well. Let me turn it over to Dennis.
MUFON is a really good one to contact, but another one is Google Peter Davenport. He has the UFO Reporting Center up in Seattle, Washington. He also has a database where if you communicate with him, he might be able to tell you if anyone else saw something the same time, same location, or general location. I don't have his website or his number offhand, but if you Google Peter Davenport, the UFO Reporting Center, what is it? NationalReportingCenter.com. UFO.com?
National UFO.
Well, I confused you enough now, you'll be able to find it. Peter Davenport, you get it.
There's another one, it's UFOstalker.com, that ties in conjunction with the UFO. Very good.
You mentioned, what was the other, I'm sorry. Sorry? www. UFO Doctor. Stalker. Oh, yes, Stalker.com. Yeah, we'll tie it. Yes, thank you.
UFO casebook from Texas.
Back to the orb, the orange orb anomaly that you used on, and this was in Houston.
About 85 miles northwest of Houston.
This was like the outskirts of the city.
Tomball, so it's the city of Tomball.
Okay. Also, if we can get our information from Radar Paranormal Research Society, we're also taking information from around Texas and also every part of Texas, because we put in categories on the anomaly and the videotaping also will help us too. So we'll get our information. But as things are happening, you have noticed that the reporting, it does take some time to report, and it takes about 10-15 minutes. But you see all these numbers go up because it is an impact. People want to know, and it's very limited to the resources of who you can talk to. In our case, in our city, there's 911, police department, and the fire department, and everything, but they use us as a reference. So something that we encourage other groups to do the same, to help out and get that information. Also, Facebook is another way of getting information real quick back. So thank you for that information experience you had back in the 80s.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to get up and just kind of share something? Or maybe just have a question that's just been burning in you, or maybe you have some doubt. You know, we're up here. You know, not everything's a UFO, but then again, you know, maybe as Dennis had mentioned, that there are things that are explainable. So the gentleman in the back, and then I'm going to get you, the young man there. Yes, sir.
Photos with those reports.
Pardon me, sir?
Any photographs with the reports?
Are there any photographs with the reports? I do know, like with MUFON, we do receive photographs. But what's amazing because of technology is that now everyone carries cell phones, and in those cell phones, you have your cameras. And we get a lot of reports from people that say they took a picture of something, and then all of a sudden they say, "This is strange. This was this was not there." Or with digital cameras, we get a lot of additional objects that people are going through something, and then we see something unusual. Yeah, a lot of it could be due to sun flare, or maybe it could be, but once in a great while, there will be something really quite extraordinary. And I do know that, for example, Dennis and Stanton, they've looked at some of the famous photographs that have been recorded, and this is before the digital camera, you know, the analog camera, Polaroid, for example. Like Stan, I'm trying to remember the gentleman that caught that photograph of that object flying over in Southern California. Oh yeah. Would you mind elaborating just a little bit about that?
Well, one of the problems today, if you're a UFO investigator, is everybody takes pictures with their cell phone cameras. And I hate to say it, but that's not high quality photography, to say the least. What I do is I try to contact Dr. Bruce McAfee, who's an optical physicist, worked for the Navy for umpteen years. He's looked at more darn UFO pictures than you can imagine. And most of them aren't useful in trying to find out what's going on. You have a light source and a picture, period, end of report. And so we need more information, and also, you know, pictures are nice, but you've got some tools with you that most people don't use when they make an observation. For example, what can you hold at arm's length that will just cover what you're looking at? We can measure the distance from your fingers to your eye. Believe it or not, you can cover the moon with an aspirin tablet. And I asked people, how big was it compared to the moon or whatever? What would you say you could cover? And they'll say a quarter or $half. And they'll say, well, was it as big as the moon? Oh, no, it wasn't as big as the moon. So we need to get in the habit of using these tools. What angle was it above the horizon? You've got your arm with you, you can find out that way. Overhead is 90 degrees, and this is 0. How long did it take to go from over the schoolhouse to over the railroad station? Well, if you count 1001, 1002, 1003, that's a second each one. What fraction of the sky did it cover? You've got your hands with you. How many hand spans across the sky? Because then you can go back to the place and check again. Oh, I see, from there to there. Don't just stand there and gawk, in other words. People, and one of the problems we have is that often the reporter, and sometimes even the investigator, well, how big was it? Well, I don't know, there was no way to judge. Well, was it as big as a Volkswagen? Well, it might have been. How far away was it, says the interrogator. Well, I don't know, there was no way to judge. Maybe half a mile? Well, it might have been. And then the article appears in the paper. Witness says Volkswagen sign UFO seen half a mile away, and the scientist says, well, you can't determine those things. That's why use what you can determine. This angle, this size, and then you compare different people's observations. But then you've got an observation, not just, well, a light went by in the sky. There are too many UFO sightings to be concerned about lights going by in the sky. And so, and even with physical trace cases, you'd be surprised how many people don't know where they were when they saw something. Well, can you go back to the exact location you were at? Well, I don't know, there were some trees over there, and, well, it's hard to evaluate if you don't know where to start. So, and write down as much as you can as soon as possible. Don't wait for somebody to ask you those questions. Where were you? What time was it? What direction were you looking? And the time sometimes is the news just started on the radio. That's a good timeline, And what direction you were looking. You don't need to be able to say west, northwest, 30 degrees or something like that. But pin it down, what's in the environment. Know where you were. A church steeple, telephone pole. There are landmarks around. We can use those. And if everybody did that, it would make life a lot simpler for investigators, I'll tell you that.
Anybody have, okay, Ismael Bayar from Laredo?
I just want to add also, there are cameras right now that you press a button, it gives you a GPS location. So when you videotape, it gives you the location and will be recorded. And you can press that as well you record simultaneously. There's a lot of features right now on some of these cameras. You videotape it or actually taking photographs. Another is a good point of reference. When we videotape some of these anomalies or flying objects, have a tree or a building, even sound helps a lot. And record yourself. Don't just record the site, the night area, all right? Make sure you turn on the camera and record yourself that you witnessed this all in one film and give the date and time. And document. You become more and more of a good practice. You get something more and more perfect, and it comes with practice. But there's a lot of things out there, a lot of good resources that you can utilize when you start investigating the night sky or an event that happens during the time of day or any event. But a good point of reference and record yourself continuously and state what are you using, a tree or a building or an landscape. I just wanted to reiterate some of more of Mr. Friedman's comments.
Now, I saw another hand here, and I think this young man, would you like to come up here and then talk in the microphone? Okay. And what's your name? Isaac. Okay, Isaac, here.
Well, what I saw was, it was like, I've seen different things several times, but it always happens in my backyard. Well, what we see is like different colors are flashing like weird stars in the night sky that sometimes at certain times they're just satellites, but at other times we think that because they're moving in crazy patterns, you can never determine that there's something else. So that's really all I have to say. 9.
You're 9. You are great. Would anyone like to comment to what Isaac mentioned here about his observation of these lights? Does anyone have any comment?
We have seen the archives or reports of the years. Of course, technology has been expanding to a point where everybody has a phone, an iPhone, or a camera, everything. But they're getting more and more eyes and ears by networking and using the internet and the communication. Has been a very good tool or resource. Don't hesitate to, you see something about it, or you see something out of the ordinary, and you say, well, it could have been a satellite, it could have been something that could be explained. But do your research, do your groundwork, and then yourself, you get that experience to see that there are actually things you can't explain, or maybe it is something engineered around that's happening. Here's a drone or a predator drone. For example, I think there's a private contract that did a craft that came out on the internet a couple of months ago that they can fly from New York to California less than 10 minutes. It's a non-manned craft drone, and it crashed in the Atlantic Ocean, and they're doing a lot of tests. So there's a lot of things going on that you see, but if you can videotape or capture it and network it, it helps us to give a better perspective of what we're going for the future. And of course, I mentioned this before, the curiosity is what makes us do this investigations and breakthroughs for the future for our kids, to see something that we might hopefully we can get something explained.
We had, somebody had asked a question about about the plane, the small plane that is said to have collided with this UFO. It was either a Beechcraft Bonanza or a Moody plane. Is based on the parts that we recovered from the desert. So I just wanted to answer that question. I didn't have the name of it earlier. Ruben, you were going to say something? Oh, no, thank you very much. We had a gentleman over there. Would you like to come up here, sir? Or?
I
Okay.
kind of have a booming voice anyway.
Oh, we can hear you.
My wife and I were at the Chitos Mountains and we saw a bright object glow in the sky. It was like refracted, like green, red, and blue. And I talked to someone I know in Alpine who happens to be an ex-NASA employee. I don't know in what capacity she was in, but I described this to her, and she said that is a specific characteristic of a geosynchronous GPS satellite. Oh, okay, thank you. She said specifically, that is what those look like.
Green, red, and blue. That
almost like refracted, almost like an aircraft, but it wasn't moving. I thought it was just very far away and it was moving very slowly, but it just was staying in one spot. So it wasn't like a bright flashing, it was more like refraction of light at a far distance. So that's a specific characteristic of the geosynchronous GPS, specifically satellite.
Very good, sir. Dennis, do you have any comments? Would you like to share anything? Or, how about yourself, Ismael? Anything else?
I just want to remind everyone, our group will be at after the conference finishes, we're going to be at the observation site of Marfa, Texas, or close to Marfa, Texas. We're going to have some of our equipment do public demonstrations and see the night sky, and hopefully we can capture something out of this world. but we want to show some of the technologies that we utilize during our investigations, and of course, answering any of your questions, how this technology works and how it's been a breakthrough for our research. And we'll welcome you. We'll be there until midnight. We'll start to be at 7, but as soon as the conference finishes, we'll be heading that way. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
I would like to ask a favor of all of you. Would you give yourself a round of applause for me? Y'all have been a good audience. May not be many, but good. Had some good questions, and during the lectures, I noticed you asked some good questions, paying attention. And we, as researchers, we hope you go home and learn something, or maybe become a researcher. With Stanton and I, we need young people to start moving up. Right?
Yes. One thing, we talked about this GPS satellite, certain one with the colors that you described. I often get asked about things that are, when I finally zero in, that they're near the horizon and the lights change color. Now, that's a standard problem for astronomers. When you have stars near the horizon, the air movement, if you will, is much more than when it's straight up above. And so you will get perfectly natural changes of color because of the air changing, winds blowing, and so forth. And so that's why it's important to say, well, where was this in the sky? Was it up there, in which you don't get this effect? Or was it down there where you do get this?
20 degrees from horizon.
20. Okay, that's quite a bit.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, what I'm concerned about is when they're right on the horizon, and people say, well, gee, it was changing color and stuff. It's important.
Much thicker atmosphere at horizon.
Yeah. So pay attention to where you are and what direction you're looking, and write it down. Don't wait until 2 months later when you tell somebody about it.
Anybody have additional comments? Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the fascinating presentation that Stan will have for us tonight, beginning at 6. Here we go, Stan.
6 or 6:30?
6.
6. Well, okay, if you say so. The title is listed as Star Travel, question mark, yes, exclamation point. And there are many different facets to this question. And first you have to decide where is it you want to go. And second, what means is there to get there. And I find there's a great deal of confusion with the words solar systems and galaxies, for example. I get people saying, I had a scientist say this to me, oh, when I was young, I used to thought, wouldn't it be great to go to Andromeda? Then I realized how much energy it would take. Andromeda is another galaxy. It's over 2 million light years away. I don't care about Andromeda. I'm not concerned about getting there. I'm interested in the local neighborhood. Many people don't realize within 55 light years of here, there's about 2,000 stars. And you go out, you double the distance, that's 8 times as many stars. So there's a zillion stars out there. And so you have to think about some of the things we've learned about space travel. For example, people like the people who don't know anything about space travel but have PhDs after their name will talk about single-stage rockets, basically. Well, you try to go to the moon that way, and it's going to be a big old rocket. Engineers are smart. They try to take advantage of cosmic freeloading, as I call it. You know, there are gravitational fields associated with the planets and all over the place, the moon. And so the smart engineer takes advantage of those. He doesn't look at the worst way to do something, he tries to find the best way to do something. So one of the things I'll be talking about tonight is to try to focus in on, well, what assumptions is the person who says it's impossible making? And usually those are impossible assumptions. I mean, they're inappropriate assumptions. We've had space travel for a long time. It's time we took advantage of what we know. And we can put stuff out near Saturn, for example. Cosmic freeloading. We go past Venus, which is closer to the sun than is Saturn, then back past us, then past Jupiter, and you get freebies all along the way. I mean, that's the way it is when you're trying to accomplish something instead of to show how it can't be done. So I would try to look at the mindset that goes with impossibility, because the history of science is loaded with claims of impossibility that simply weren't true. Wrong assumptions made by the people who say, well, I don't know how to do it, so it can't be done. That's not science. That's bias, prejudice, ignorance, etc. So that comes into the discussion tonight, too. You know, it's like trying to get from my house, can you cross the United States in a day? Not on a bicycle. You know, you've got to pick the appropriate approach. So a little thinking goes a long way in getting rid of the objections of the nasty, noisy negativists, as I like to call them when I'm being polite. So we'll talk about that tonight.
Okay, we're going to have one final opportunity for anybody that would like to talk about their own experiences, and then we're going to close the session. I'd just like to put in a promo for our next lecture that Ruben and I are doing. I know that all of you who have attended this conference this weekend are familiar with the Mexico's Roswell case, but we're going to take you through it step by step. We're going to show you some of the research that we've been done. We're going to show you some photographs that we took when we were down there with the History Channel. We're going to talk, we're going to summarize Mrs. Johnny Chambers and her son's testimony. And so we're going to go through the whole thing related to the 1974 crash of a UFO near Presidio, Texas. And that is scheduled to begin at 3 o'clock, and we'll go until 4:30. And then we're going to take a break for the evening meal. But if you come back a little early, because Stan is going to talk about the star travel that he just mentioned, beginning at 6 or shortly thereafter. But we're going to have a musical interlude. Sometime we're going to probably start at around 5:30 or so and let them go for about half an hour. Some of the performers that are out at the Dude of the Dead Music Festival here 1 mile north of here are going to be here to just do a little demo of some of the music you'll be hearing out there at the music festival tonight after we finish with Stanton Friedman's presentation. We're going out there to the music festival and enjoy some of that. So we're going to have Skin and Bones and David Shane. Do you want to say anything more about that, Brad? Kind of tease it a little? Are you going to have to wipe everybody's memory now? Let me put my sunglasses on.
Yes, yes. Like I said, we have some tremendous talent from the Big Bend region. David Shane is probably the only import we have, and he's I'd say, dual citizen of the Big Bend area, but he's up from Wimberley. And I had the pleasure of going on a Copper Canyon trip last Easter. There is a Copper Canyon trip that's put on by the, I guess what would now be the former Mexican consulate around Easter. So if anybody is interested in going down there and taking that, well, we ride on buses mostly, but we did get to take a train trip. It's a beautiful, beautiful place to visit. We didn't have any trouble at all. It was a very safe and secure trip. And it'll probably happen again next Easter. But anyway, David did some campfire songs and things like that. We had a big time down there. And so I'm looking forward to hearing him again. Of course, as I mentioned, there are a lot of acts that are going to be performing at the Dude of the Dead concert tonight, starting probably about 6 o'clock. They're going to have some open mic, and it's just going to be a fun event. So come and I would say prepare for like a tailgate party or something like that. Bring your own lawn chair, your own beer cooler, soft drinks, whatever. So it's BYOB out there. So you can stop at all the stores and stock up on your drinks and eats. And they will have vendors out there with chicken on a stick, and of course these wonderful tacos that boys, the men, prepare. And so it's going to be a great party out there tonight. And we're looking forward to having a lot of folks. And I think that you're going to be really surprised at the level of talent that you're going to find there. A lot of bluegrass and rock music, and a whole lot more. So we're going to be in for some surprises, and this is the 5th year of the Dude of the Dead. And if you want a little preview, if you have access to the computer out there, dudeofthedead.net is their website. Again, that's dudeofthedead.net. And they have video links of some of the acts that will be playing there. So tune in and have a good time. So if you can't be here in person, be there on the net. Thanks, sir.
We'll see everybody at 3.
And we'll see everybody here at 3 for Mexico's Roswell.